Okay, this is part 2 of the ecology lesson, and it is officially the last lesson of our converted to an online course. And we are going to pick up following what we just discussed, which was symbiotic relationships. I'm kind of circling back to the feeding relationships in ecosystems and looking specifically at trophic levels. And I mentioned this in part 1 and said that we would go into it in more detail, and that's what we're going to do now. So trophic levels really are levels in the distribution and movement of energy through an ecosystem. So in elementary school, you learn about food chains and the way that energy moves from one organism to another and when one organism eats another. So a mouse eats a plant and then a wolf eats that mouse. So that's a very simple example of a food chain. Well, trophic levels represent a feeding step in this energy transfer as well. So trophic levels have to do with biomass. Biomass is the amount of organic matter comprising a group of organisms in a habitat. So it could be a population or a particular combination of populations of organisms in an ecosystem or habitat. So biomass refers to the total amount of that organism. So for example, a wolf has more mass than a mouse, but the total biomass of small rodents in an ecosystem is going to be larger than the total biomass of the large predators. And I'll show you some more examples of that. So as you move up a food chain, both available energy and biomass decrease. And that is why the pyramid that represents trophic levels is a pyramid shape. And I introduced this in the last lesson. So the producers are down here. Remember, that's the plants, things that make energy from the sun. And then you have your, this symbol is for primary consumers. So those are the organisms that are eating the producers, your secondary consumers, and so on up the pyramid. Well, this section down here is largest because it has the largest biomass and the largest available energy. Oops, I got my eye in the wrong place there. And you really have to think in the context of all of a particular group of organisms to grasp this biomass and available energy concept and not an individual organism. So again, if you think about algae, individual algae are very, very small biomass and available energy. But if you think of all of the algae in a given ecosystem compared to all of the alligators, if you were to pile them all up on a scale, the algae would have a more biomass than all of the gators. And as an extension of that, more available energy. But if you can remember the reasoning for the shape of the pyramid, that will help you remember how energy is transferred and why those upper regions are smaller. And so this is the movement of energy. And each time energy is transferred, it's diminished. And there's a couple of different reasons for that. When you eat, some of that energy is stored on your body or in your body, but a lot of that energy is utilized. So if a mouse eats a bunch of berries, and then later on that day a fox eats the mouse, the fox isn't necessarily going to glean all of the energy from those berries because those berries have been digested. The mouse has utilized that energy, and we know that when we use a lot of energy, we also generate a lot of heat. That's why you don't want to go on a run in the afternoon in Florida in August. That heat is a form of energy as well. So energy is utilized and lost as heat by organisms. And so not all of the energy consumed is going to be passed to the next level. All right, so this is a not drawn version, a more organized looking version than the one I just drew. But again, it shows the producers at the bottom. Remember, automatic. These produce their own energy 99% of the time. That is by way of photosynthesis. So all energy ultimately comes from our friend the sun, and it's coming in by way of these producers, which is generating glucose. And then when they're consumed by primary consumers, remember herbivores are plant eaters, when they're consumed by primary consumers, the primary consumers are benefiting from that stored energy. However, they're not getting all of it because some of that energy was used by the plant, some of it was lost as heat. Then when those primary consumers are consumed by small carnivores or omnivores, the energy, oh, I better switch my color. That energy is transferred this way. But again, you've got loss of energy as heat, and you've also got energy being used by the organism, which means, I mean, we know energy is never created or destroyed, so energy used means it's converted to kinetic energy. It could have used it to move around, heat energy to stay warm at night, any number of other conversions that living things do. And then finally, this movement here. So it takes all of this biomass of producers to support a very small amount of tertiary or top carnivores in an ecosystem. Okay, and this is just putting this into numbers. So if you look at the energy and biomass that exists in the producers in an ecosystem, and you consider that to be 100% of the energy eating the ecosystem, the first consumer or the first group of consumers is only going to benefit from 10% of that energy. So that means you're going to have 90% not pass to the next level. And then the next level consumer is only going to have 1% of this original 100%. So that just gives you a more numerical idea of how energy is lost and not passed level to level. And if you think about the numbers of different types of organisms and ecosystems that you are familiar with, it will make sense to you. All right, so now just again looking at this, another representation of this trophic pyramid with some actual organisms in it. So at the bottom you have your producers. So these are, let's see, that looks like a shark. So this is definitely a marine ecosystem with salt water. And the producers are going to be plants, marine plants that are gleaning energy through photosynthesis. And then it looks like the small, or the primary consumers are shrimp in this case. And then those shrimp are consumed by some decent sized fish. Those are the secondary consumers. And then the top or tertiary consumer in this case is a shark. So you're going to have your highest biomass down here and your highest energy. So what that means is if you were to use one of those like old Tommy balances or scales, and you were to put all the producers, so this whole group, pile it here, and then this whole group, pile it there, then it would do one of these numbers. I'm trying to show this tilting. There we go. So your producers all together are going to have more mass than your consumers all together. And that's because of the available energy that can move up the different levels of the pyramid. I apologize, sorry about that. All right, so let's circle back to the food chain. So a simple food chain looks like this. It's a very simple model. It's the one that you learn first when you learn about these types of relationships and ecosystems. And if you take what we just talked about with the pyramid, in this case, if you were to draw your hypothetical pyramid, it would look like this. With your algae and floating plants, those are your producers. And then your aquatic crustaceans would represent your primary consumers, your fish, your secondary consumers, and your raccoons, your tertiary consumers. So that's just taking that idea of trophic levels and applying it back to what we understand to be a food chain. Here's an example of another food chain. The producer in this case, and I love how it shows all the energy coming in from the sun, and water is what is also required for photosynthesis, and carbon dioxide, but we'll review that shortly. So you have the grass, which is consumed by the grasshopper. So in this case, the grasshopper is the primary consumer. The grasshopper is consumed by a snake, making the snake the secondary consumer. And then the snake is consumed by the hawk, making the hawk a tertiary consumer. And so there's your basic food chain. Just to review, your highest amount of biomass would be here. Highest amount of biomass, highest amount of energy. And then all along the way here, you're going to lose energy as heat. And then also in what's utilized for the functions for these organisms. Now this particular food chain brings another element in. This is the decomposer. So once this hawk dies, it will be either scavenged or decomposed. And if it's broken down by a fungus, the fungus is going to take the nutrients from whatever the hawk consumed in order to maintain its life and restore those back to the environment. And they can be utilized by the grass, because plants, we know that they require carbon dioxide, water, and sunlight for photosynthesis, but they also require other elements and nutrients, and decomposers can return those to the soil for plants. All right, so the food chain is a very simplistic, sort of unidirectional representation of the movement of energy, and you can look at it in the context of trophic levels. You can also look at trophic levels in a food web, and a food web is essentially multiple food chains and possibilities all piled up together. So a food chain is here on the left, so it's the plants to the grasshopper to, I think that's a mouse, small mammal, and then the mouse to the owl. But you can also look at other potential paths for this energy. So the grass in that ecosystem could be consumed by the grasshopper, but it could also be consumed by I think that's a bunny rabbit. This picture's kind of blurry. By a bunny rabbit, or by a deer. And then let's follow the path for the bunny rabbit. The bunny rabbit could then be consumed by a fox or an owl. And so it looks like nothing consumes the fox or the owl, so those are both at the top. And let's look at the deer. The deer can consume leaves from this tree or this grass. Can be, is that a mosquito? A bug? A mosquito, I think, be consumed by the mosquito, which can be consumed by the spider. So anyway, you see there's like a lot of different interacting food chains there, and you could pull out any individual food chain and look at it that way, or you can look at the food web as a whole. And then, so if you're looking for your trophic levels here and here, those are your producers. And then I'll use a different color for, let's see, the primary consumers. Here, here, here. Is that it? And then secondary consumers. This guy could be a secondary consumer or a tertiary consumer. So anyway, you get the gist of it. You can work through and look at it and identify the different parts and trophic levels that way as well. Here's another example of a different way to represent a food web. I like how this one has the producers represented in green, and then the arrows where energy is moving from the producers to the primary consumers are also represented in green. The primary consumers and the secondary consumers are sort of lumped together in red. So the colors are being used here to represent the producers, and then these are sort of the mid-range. This would be the primary and secondary consumers, and then you've got your predatory carnivorous species at the top. And those would be your tertiary, quaternary, etc. consumers. And so again, reviewing, you'd have your highest amount of biomass here. Also your highest amount of available energy. And then the movement of energy is this way, but the amount of available energy is going to be less as you move up. You're going to have less biomass here. So even if you were to pile up all the killer whales, marsh hawks, bald eagles, harbor seals together and weigh them against all the marsh vegetation, you're going to have a higher amount of energy and biomass in the marsh vegetation because of that loss that happens along the way. Here's another example of a soil food web. This one's nice because it actually, down here in this section, it shows you and lists the trophic levels. So the first trophic level is your producers, and in this case it refers to them as photosynthesizers. The second trophic level is the decomposers. So here looking at the decomposing of organic matter by bacteria, fungi, and your root feeders, which are your nematodes. And then the third trophic level, it says shredders, predators, and grazers. So here's arthropods are shredders, predators, and then the higher level predators are going to be the birds and other animals. But this is just another representation of this. And of course, all energy ultimately comes from the sun. Oops. So that this is ultimately where the energy is going. And then again, highest biomass down here, and lessens as it moves up towards these higher level predators. All right, so that's it for trophic levels, food chains, and food webs. And the last thing that we're going to look at is nutrient cycles. We've already talked about this some, we just haven't identified it as nutrient cycles necessarily. So cycling maintains homeostasis. Homeo, that prefix homo is same. Oops. And stasis is to stop. So homeostasis is to stay the same or balance in the environment. So there's 3 cycles, water cycle, carbon cycle, and nitrogen cycle that we're going to look closely at here. Most students are already familiar with the water cycle, and you may or may not be familiar with the carbon and nitrogen cycles. We'll start with the water cycle. So I know I talked about the ecospheres early in the course, where you can buy the little globe things from Amazon, and it has the brine shrimp and the substrate, like the rocks, and it has bacteria in there, and then algae, and they can exist in there with only light coming in. And the whole of the water cycle, all these cycles are also occurring there. If they weren't, then it wouldn't be able to exist without some kind of something being added or taken away. So evaporation, transpiration, condensation, and precipitation. The most straightforward for students are usually these 3. Evaporation, that's liquid water changing to gas. You can see this really well in the mornings above the water, like a kind of a fog. And you can also see it over a boiling pot of water, evaporation. Condensation is what you get on the outside of a cold glass of tea on a summer day, because the water in the air is hitting that cool temperature of that glass and changing from a gas to a liquid and condensating on the side of the glass. And precipitation, of course, is after condensation occurs in the atmosphere and the form of clouds, precipitation as rain, snow, sleet, hail can occur. Transpiration is less familiar to students. Transpiration, this one is from plants. And it results in dew. So plants transpire all the time, but they do most transpiring at night in order to avoid water loss. And also we're just able to see it because the water doesn't evaporate off of the plants from transpiration as quickly, so we can see where the droplets have accumulated, and that's the dew. So transpiration is water from plants. It's almost how when we exhale, there's water in that. It's almost like the exhale of a plant, water from plants. It comes out of the stomata. You don't have to know that detail. Okay, so now let's look at this. So we can start in a cycle. It goes around and round and round, so you can start anywhere. Let's start at the clouds. So here we have precipitation, and once rain has occurred, that water is going to run off, and that's where it runs across the land down into, it's either going to get into a water source, lake, stream, ocean, river, or it's going to do what's called percolation, which is moving in and becoming part of the groundwater. And then from there, it can evaporate out, and so that's what's being shown here and here. Or it can be used by plants from the ground or from a water source, and then transpire into the atmosphere. And so then it's back up into the atmosphere where it's going to condense when it hits that colder air, become clouds, and then precipitation, and the whole thing goes again. And so that's the water cycle. Oh, this one's kind of crooked. Next is the carbon cycle. Now, we've already talked about this, we just didn't call it the carbon cycle. We spent a lot of time talking about the relationship between photosynthesis and cellular respiration when we discussed just energy and ATP and all that good stuff with the chloroplast and the mitochondria. And I showed you this relationship between the 2 equations. So for photosynthesis, plants require carbon dioxide and water. And then they use that with sunlight to make glucose and oxygen. Then glucose and oxygen are used in the process of cellular respiration, and that is how ATP is generated. And remember, that's the cellular energy currency. Now, I've circled the carbons here because this is carbon cycling. So we've looked at this in the context of just the equation as a whole and energy, but now I want you to really focus in on the carbon. See how the carbon is being reused and recycled and moved through this relationship. So photosynthesis and respiration cycle carbon and oxygen through the environment. There's other examples of carbon cycling as well. Burning of fossil fuels. This is going to release what's called greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, which are carbon-rich And then cellular respiration is going to release carbon dioxide, which we just discussed. Photosynthesis is going to utilize carbon dioxide. It's going to be drawing it out of the atmosphere and then turning it into glucose. And as glucose, it's going to be consumed by primary consumers, then by higher level consumers, and that's what we just looked at in the food chains, food webs, and trophic levels. The higher level consumers are going to exhale, well, actually all the living things are going to exhale the carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. Plants do this as well. Remember, plants make ATP. All cells need ATP. Soil microbes releasing it back into the atmosphere. And then when these organisms die and become detritus, the decomposers will harvest, and that's the case for dying plants as well, will harvest the carbon and return it to the soil, and then it will ultimately be returned to the atmosphere in the form of carbon dioxide again. So that is the carbon cycle. All right, finally, the nitrogen cycle. A lot of people think that the atmosphere is made up mainly of oxygen. It's actually 78 to 80% of air is made up of nitrogen gas, or atmospheric nitrogen. Organisms, we can't actually use it in that form. So for us to utilize it, it has to be fixed or changed, and that can be achieved by lighting and also by bacteria. And so certain types of bacteria, and we also have developed industrial technologies that can be used to fix nitrogen as well. And what nitrogen fixation is converting atmospheric nitrogen, which is the gas in the form of N2, into a form that organisms can use, which is ammonium, which is nitrogen combined with, or a nitrogen combined with 4 hydrogens. And that can be used to make organic compounds like amino acids. Remember when we looked at our different macromolecules and amino acids, which make up proteins, and by now you understand how important those are. They all contain a nitrogen component. So nitrogen is really important for proteins. We need it, but we can't take it in this N2 form. It has to be the NH4. So several types of nitrogen-fixing bacteria live in symbiotic relationship, and remember symbiotic relationships from the last lesson, with plants of the legume family. So that's like your nuts and beans. A lot of your nuts and beans are legumes. And so they actually live in these little nodules on the roots of the plant, and they fix the nitrogen that the plant needs right there on its roots so that it can absorb the usable version of it. Some other nitrogen-fixing bacteria also live just freely in the soil. And there's a type of cyanobacteria that can fix nitrogen as well, and they are found in semi-aquatic environments. If you remember, cyanobacteria, they're kind of similar to algae. They're photosynthetic, but they can also fix nitrogen. So rice paddies, some other like semi-wet or aquatic environments depend on the nitrogen-fixing capability of cyanobacteria. And so here is a depiction of the nitrogen cycle. And again, we can start anywhere. So let's start in the atmosphere. So in both cases, you see it's some type of bacteria. So nitrogen-fixing bacteria or, oops, that's the arrow going the other direction. Okay, so nitrogen-fixing bacteria. So they are going to fix the nitrogen. I thought I had one with lightning in it. Oh, that's this one. Okay, we'll get there in a minute. Nitrogen-fixing bacteria in the root nodules of legumes. And then that nitrogen can be utilized by the plant. And it's going to, from there, the plants can be consumed by animals, and it can be decomposed. So animals and plants, once they die, are going to be decomposed, which is going to return some of those forms of nitrogen to the soil. The other is if it's just free nitrogen-fixing bacteria in the soil, and then in that case, you can skip the decomposers, and it can move from ammonium to what's called denitrifying, which basically returns it back to the atmosphere. And then there's a go-between too, where it can go from nitrates and be used by plants. So basically the majority of nitrogen is in atmospheric form. We can't use it that way. Plants can't use it that way. It has to be changed to ammonium by nitrogen-fixing bacteria in legumes or free nitrogen-fixing bacteria in the soil. From there, it can be consumed by animals, or it can be nitrified into nitrates and consumed and brought into plants that way and consumed by animals. That's how it gets into the living organisms. Then those organisms die, decomposers return it to the soil, and then it either cycles back into nitrates, back into plants and animals, or is denitrified and returns to the atmosphere in the form of nitrogen gas. The nitrogen cycle, I think, is the most complex, and you don't have to understand all the chemistry. You just need to have an understanding and a good idea of how it moves through ecosystems between the abiotic and biotic factors. Okay, here it is again. So again, we're at atmospheric nitrogen. I just wanted to include this other depiction because it is kind of complex, can be confusing. It can be fixed by way of lightning, or most commonly, nitrogen fixing bacteria. From there, it's made into ammonium. Then it's nitrified to nitrites and nitrates, where it can be taken in by plants. Plants can be taken in by animals. When plants and animals die, they're decomposed, returns to the soil. And then if there is an excess, denitrified and returned to the atmosphere. All right, so I talked about how in a food pyramid, this is the movement of energy. I talked about how the available energy is going to be higher down here and then get less. So if these arrows represent an amount, it's going to get less as you move up. However, the only thing that increases in this instance is toxins. And I talked about this at some point in class. I can't remember the context exactly, but I remember we did discuss it. Someone mentioned organic foods, and I talked about how it doesn't make any sense to buy organic fruits and vegetables if you're not eating clean meat. And this is the reason why. So you're losing energy at every level because of it being utilized by organisms and also heat, but you're not utilizing or losing toxins. So if there's toxins in producers, they're going to be spread out across the entirety of that biomass. But as they move up, the amount of toxins doesn't change. So as the biomass decreases, okay, sorry about that. I put that shit off for some reason. I'm trying to pick up where I left off. So I was talking about how toxins decrease as you move up from producers to the larger predatory species in a food chain. And the reason why is because it's not utilized or lost. So if you think of it in the context of ratios, and you have a high biomass compared to a certain amount of toxin, and the same amount of toxin in a lower biomass, your concentration of toxin is going to be higher. So I'm going to give this just these numbers are arbitrary. I don't know how DDT is actually measured, so I'm not making any assumptions that I do, but I just want you to think about this. The best way to think about this is mathematically. So let's assume that we have 100 units of DDT. And we have 10 tons of producer and 1 ton of consumer, or of, the higher level consumers. So if we divide that 100 units over 10 tons, we're going to have 10 units per ton in the producers. But we're going to have 100 units per ton in your higher level consumers. Does that make sense? And the reason is because this is your biomass. And your biomass is decreasing over here because you've lost that energy, and as a result, you've lost biomass, but your toxin is staying the same. So if you eat meat that consumed plants with pesticides, you're actually going to get a greater concentration of the pesticides than if you were to just eat the plant that had the pesticide on it itself, which is a really common misconception. So hopefully you can utilize that information to make good choices at the grocery store. All right, that is it for this lesson, and for this the last lesson in the course. So hopefully this has been beneficial to you all, and this is the last of the material that will be covered on your exam. There is one photosynthesis lab that you need to complete, but other than how it relates to the carbon cycle and abiotic factors more generally, that information won't be on your exam.